Nature holds secrets that sometimes unfold in the most extraordinary ways. But nothing could have prepared Martha Wilson for how a single act of compassion during a raging storm would return to her life in an astonishing way. In her 68 years on this earth, Martha had witnessed countless storms from her mountain cabin in the Montana wilderness, but none quite like the one that brought an unexpected visitor into her life on that fateful October night. The rain pounded against her cabin windows like angry fists, while wind howled through the towering pines that surrounded her home. Martha sat in her favorite rocking chair, wrapping herself tighter in her grandmother's old quilt. Since losing her husband Robert 3 years ago, she had grown accustomed to the solitude of mountain living, finding comfort in the predictable rhythms of nature. But tonight was different. The storm raged with unusual fury, making the old cabin creak and groan under its assault. The weather forecast had warned of a severe system moving through the mountains, but this was beyond anything they had predicted. Lightning illuminated the darkness outside her window in brilliant flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of her home. As another thunderclap rolled through the valley, Martha heard something else, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A weak, plaintive cry barely audible above the wind. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, a trick of the howling gusts that whipped around her cabin. But there it was again, desperate and unmistakable. Martha rose from her chair, her arthritic knees protesting the sudden movement. Common sense told her to stay inside where it was safe and warm, but something about that cry pulled at her heart. Grabbing her heavy raincoat and flashlight, she made her way to the back door. The moment she opened it, the wind nearly tore it from her grasp. The beam of her flashlight cut through the curtain of rain, sweeping across her back porch and into the darkness beyond. The cry came again, weaker this time, drawing her attention to a cluster of fallen branches near her woodpile. As she carefully made her way down the slippery steps, her light caught a glimpse of movement. There, huddled against the logs, was a sight that made her heart stop. A bear cub, no more than a few months old, lay shivering violently. Its dark fur was matted and soaked, its small body covered in mud and debris from the storm. As Martha's light fell upon it, it raised its head weakly, letting out another pitiful cry. Martha knew the dangers. Every mountain resident knew better than to interfere with wildlife, especially bears. The mother had to be somewhere nearby, she thought. But as she stood in the driving rain, watching the cub's desperate struggle to move, she realized with growing certainty that no mother bear would have left her young one alone in such conditions. Time seemed to stand still as Martha faced a decision that would change her life forever. The cub's eyes, filled with a pain and fear that transcended species, met hers. In that moment, Martha Wilson, the cautious widow who had lived by the rules of mountain life for decades, felt something shift in her soul. "Lord, help me," she whispered, knowing what she was about to do went against everything she had ever learned about surviving in the wilderness. But as another flash of lightning illuminated the scene, she saw the cub's head slump back down, its strength failing. Martha made her choice. Some might call it foolish, others reckless. But as she carefully approached the dying cub, she knew she could never live with herself if she turned away. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known on that stormy night, was that this decision would lead to discoveries that would shake her understanding of the natural world and change not only her life, but the lives of many others in ways she could never have imagined. Time raced against Martha as she carried the limp bear cub into her warm cabin. Its small body felt like ice against her chest, barely moving except for shallow breaths. Years of caring for injured animals on her mountain property had taught her the basics of survival, but this was different. This was a wild bear, and every lesson she had ever learned screamed at her to stop. Still, she worked with focused determination. Martha wrapped the cub in thick towels, gently drying its soaked fur while keeping her movements slow and careful. The kitchen thermometer told a frightening story. The cub's temperature was dangerously low. She remembered reading somewhere that hypothermia in young animals required gradual warming to prevent shock. Using her electric blanket set on low, Martha created a warm nest on her living room floor. Hour after hour, she sat beside the tiny creature, watching for any sign of improvement. As the storm continued its assault outside, she spoke softly to the cub, telling it stories about her life on the mountain, about Robert, about anything that came to mind. Whether it was her gentle voice or the warmth slowly seeping into its body, the cub's breathing gradually became stronger. By morning, Martha knew she had crossed a point of no return. The cub had survived the night, but now she faced an even greater challenge. Her first call was to the local library where her friend Susan worked. "I need every book you have on bears," Martha said, carefully avoiding any explanation of why. By afternoon, her kitchen table was covered with books about black bears, their habits, and their care. What she learned both frightened and amazed her. The cub was probably around 3 months old, too young to survive alone, but old enough to be dangerous. The books warned repeatedly about the risks of caring for wild bears, how they could never truly be domesticated. Martha read every word carefully, taking notes in her old recipe notebook, determined to do this right. The shed behind her cabin became her next project. Robert had always kept it organized, and now Martha cleaned it with new purpose. She moved her gardening tools to the basement, installed thick straw bedding in one corner, and reinforced the walls with extra planks. Working through her arthritis, she created a space that would keep the cub safe and contained while giving it room to grow stronger. Each day brought new challenges and discoveries. Martha learned to prepare a special formula that would provide the nutrition a growing bear needed. She watched in wonder as the cub began to show its personality, curious about everything but still cautious. Its favorite spot became an old wooden crate lined with her softest blankets, reminding Martha of how her children would make forts from cardboard boxes decades ago. Something else was happening too, something Martha hadn't expected. As she spent hours observing the cub, noting its behaviors and needs in her notebook, she felt her heart opening in a way it hadn't since Robert passed. The cub's trust in her grew slowly, like a fragile flower blooming in spring. When it first approached her without fear, accepting food from her hand, Martha felt tears rolling down her cheeks. She named the cub Storm, marking the night that brought them together. Every evening, she would sit in the shed, reading her bear books while Storm explored his new space. The books warned against forming emotional attachments, but Martha knew it was already too late. She saw it in the way Storm watched for her through the shed window, in how he would settle down to sleep only after hearing her voice wish him good night. Martha kept her secret carefully, knowing few would understand. But in the quiet moments watching Storm grow stronger each day, she felt a sense of purpose she had thought was lost forever. What she didn't realize was that these peaceful days were just the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would lead to discoveries beyond anything she could imagine. Spring painted the mountains with new life as Storm grew from a fragile cub into a stronger, more confident bear. Martha's daily routine now revolved around his care, each day bringing new surprises that she carefully recorded in her leather-bound journal. The early morning light would find her collecting berries and plants that her books identified as natural bear food, determined to teach Storm the tastes he would need to survive in the wild. From her kitchen window, Martha watched Storm explore his expanding world with growing confidence. She had gradually extended his enclosed area to include a portion of the forest behind her cabin, creating a space where he could learn essential skills. Her heart swelled with pride when she first saw him naturally digging for roots, his powerful nose guiding him to food sources hidden beneath the earth. The journal pages filled quickly with her observations. "Storm showed remarkable problem-solving today," she wrote one evening. When his favorite ball rolled under the log pile, he carefully removed each log until he could reach it, then meticulously replaced them. Such moments of intelligence both delighted and unsettled Martha. Each day revealed new depths to Storm's understanding that went beyond mere animal instinct. Their morning routine became a dance of mutual trust. Storm would wait patiently while Martha brought his breakfast, no longer the frantic cub desperate for food. He learned to take the berries gently from her wrinkled hands, his eyes always watching her face. Martha noticed how he seemed to understand her moods, becoming quieter on days when her arthritis pained her, more playful when she felt strong. Teaching Storm survival skills became an unexpected adventure. Martha created challenges for him, hiding food in increasingly difficult places, encouraging him to use his natural abilities. She watched in amazement as he learned to overturn rocks to find insects, just as wild bears would. His growing strength showed in how easily he could now move objects that once seemed impossible for him. The afternoon rains brought special moments that Martha treasured. Storm would take shelter in his covered area, and Martha would sit nearby in her old wooden chair, protected by the overhang. She would read aloud from her books or tell him stories about the mountains, and Storm would listen with an intensity that seemed almost human. His eyes would follow her hand gestures, his head tilting at changes in her voice. One particular day stood out in Martha's memory, carefully documented in her journal. Storm had been watching a group of sparrows bathing in a puddle near his enclosure. Instead of charging at them as a predator might, he carefully lowered himself to the ground, remaining still until the birds grew comfortable with his presence. Martha watched in amazement as this continued day after day, until the sparrows would bathe and feed peacefully near the young bear. As summer progressed, Storm's size and strength increased dramatically. Martha's journal noted every change, from his growing food requirements to his increasingly complex behaviors. She observed how he would create food caches, storing berries and nuts in specific locations, showing a level of planning that amazed her. He developed his own signals too, different sounds and movements that Martha learned to interpret as clearly as any spoken language. The most remarkable developments were the ones that seemed to transcend natural bear behavior. Storm began bringing injured animals to the edge of his enclosure, small creatures he could have easily harmed. Martha documented each instance: a robin with a broken wing, a young rabbit caught in thorns. It was as if he had absorbed her capacity for compassion, transforming it into something uniquely his own. Yet beneath the joy of watching Storm thrive, Martha felt a growing awareness of time passing. Her journal entries began noting behaviors that showed Storm's increasing independence. He spent more time practicing his foraging skills, less time seeking her attention. While part of her heart ached at these changes, she knew this was what she had worked toward all along. The final pages of her summer journal held both pride and melancholy. "Storm shows all the natural behaviors he will need to survive," she wrote. "His strength and intelligence have grown beyond anything I could have imagined. But there is something more, something I cannot quite explain. When I look into his eyes now, I see not just a bear, but a being capable of understanding far deeper than I ever thought possible. What he will become, what he will do with this understanding, only time will tell." What Martha could not know, as she wrote those words, was how prophetic they would prove to be. The true depth of Storm's intelligence and the shocking discoveries that awaited her were still months away, hidden in a future that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the natural world. Autumn painted the mountains in brilliant golds and reds as Martha faced the hardest decision of her journey with Storm. The young bear had grown into a magnificent creature, strong and capable, his black fur gleaming with health. Her journal entry that morning trembled with emotion. "Today I must do what my heart fights against, but what I know is right. Storm must return to his true home, the wilderness that calls to him more strongly each day." The signs had been clear for weeks. Storm's restlessness grew with each passing day, his eyes increasingly drawn to the deep forest beyond his enclosure. His powerful muscles rippled beneath his fur as he paced, no longer content with the boundaries that had once kept him safe. Martha knew that keeping him any longer would be selfish, a betrayal of everything she had worked toward. She spent the final week preparing him as best she could. Though her books warned against it, Martha increased his food portions, wanting to give him every advantage possible. She watched him practice all the survival skills she had helped him develop, her heart swelling with pride even as it broke. Storm seemed to sense the coming change, staying closer to her than he had in weeks, his gentle eyes often seeking hers. The morning of the release dawned clear and cool. Martha had chosen this day carefully, knowing the autumn berries were plentiful and winter still weeks away. She opened her journal one last time within Storm's sight, her tradition of documenting their time together coming to its end. "I release not just a bear today, but a piece of my heart. These months have taught me that love knows no boundaries, that miracles can come in the most unexpected forms." Moving with purpose despite her tears, Martha began the release process she had carefully planned. She opened the outer gate of Storm's enclosure, creating a path to freedom. Then came the hardest part. She stepped back, far enough to give him the courage to leave, close enough to witness his final moments in her care. Storm's behavior in those moments would stay with Martha forever. He approached the open gate cautiously at first, his nose testing the air. Then he turned to look at her, and in that gaze, Martha saw a depth of understanding that transcended the barrier between human and animal. He took a step toward her, then back toward freedom, caught between two worlds. "Go on," Martha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You know what to do now. You are ready." As if understanding her words, Storm moved with growing confidence toward the forest. At the edge of the trees, he paused one final time, looking back at the human who had saved his life and raised him to be strong. Martha forced herself to smile through her tears, giving him the final gift of her blessing to leave. Then Storm was gone, his dark form disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Martha stood motionless, watching the place where he had vanished, listening as the sounds of his movement grew fainter and finally ceased. The mountain seemed unnaturally quiet, as if nature itself was marking this moment of parting. Back in her cabin, Martha closed her journal and placed it carefully on her shelf. The house felt eerily empty, the silence heavy with absence. She moved through her evening routine mechanically, trying not to look at the now empty enclosure visible from her window. Every sound from the forest made her heart leap, but she knew she had to resist the urge to look for him. Storm needed to find his own way now. As darkness fell, Martha sat in her rocking chair, wrapping herself in the same quilt she had worn the night she found Storm. "This is how it should be," she told herself firmly. "This is what success looks like." Yet she couldn't stop the tears that fell as she imagined him out there, alone in the vast wilderness. She believed with all her heart that she would never see him again, that this chapter of her life had closed forever. But Martha Wilson had no way of knowing that fate had other plans. The most astonishing part of her story was yet to unfold, waiting in the months ahead to reveal a truth more remarkable than anything she could have imagined. The mountain winters passed slowly after Storm's departure. Martha filled her lonely days tending her garden and watching the wilderness from her porch, but the emptiness in her heart remained. As spring painted the slopes with new life, strange occurrences began surfacing around her cabin that defied simple explanation. It started with mysterious changes to her property. Each morning, Martha found her bird feeders mysteriously refilled with wild berries and pine cones. Her firewood pile grew instead of diminishing, fresh logs appearing neatly stacked. The path to her well remained mysteriously clear of debris, even after storms. She first credited kind neighbors, but living miles from the nearest home made this impossible. The mysteries deepened with more inexplicable events. Fresh fish from the stream appeared on her porch, carefully laid out like offerings. Her garbage cans remained untouched by raccoons despite the rich food smells. Even her garden, usually ravaged by deer, stayed protected while neighboring properties reported heavy damage. Something was watching over her property with remarkable intelligence and care. The truth began unfolding one misty morning when Martha witnessed a sight that stole her breath. A massive black bear, larger than any she had ever seen, was gently guiding a limping fox toward her cabin. The bear's movements were hauntingly familiar, and when he turned his head, Martha's world shifted. Those eyes, filled with unmistakable intelligence, belonged to Storm, but this was not the young bear she had released. Storm had grown enormous, his muscles rippling with power beneath his gleaming coat. Yet despite his intimidating size, his movements remained incredibly gentle as he settled the injured fox into a sheltered corner of her porch. Before disappearing into the forest, he looked directly at her window and made a soft sound she remembered from his cub days, a sound that brought tears to her eyes. This encounter opened Martha's eyes to a pattern she had missed. Small injured animals had been appearing near her doorstep for weeks, always in places where she would easily find them. Birds with broken wings, young deer with twisted legs, even small rabbits with thorn wounds would appear as if placed by careful hands. Through patient observation, she realized Storm was deliberately bringing these animals to her, remembering how she had once healed him. Local rangers brought the next shocking revelation during an unexpected visit. "Mrs. Wilson," Ranger Thompson said, settling at her kitchen table, "we need to discuss something unprecedented happening in these mountains. They shared reports of a massive black bear exhibiting behavior never before documented in wildlife history. Storm had been seen leading lost hikers to safety, marking safe paths with broken branches, and even alerting the ranger station to emergencies by making distinctive noises near their outpost. The rangers' stories multiplied. Storm had been observed breaking ice on frozen ponds so deer could drink, protecting other bears' cubs when their mothers were foraging, and creating food caches that smaller animals could access during harsh weather. He showed levels of organization and planning that went far beyond natural bear behavior. Wildlife researchers soon arrived, setting up observation posts around the mountain. Their cameras captured footage that left them speechless. Storm had established what they could only describe as a complex network of care throughout the wilderness. He created protected corridors where smaller animals could travel safely, taught younger bears how to find specific healing plants, and demonstrated tool use that showed remarkable problem-solving abilities. The most astonishing discovery came when Martha followed Storm's tracks after a summer storm. Deep in the forest, she found what researchers later called an animal sanctuary. Storm had created a protected area where injured animals gathered. She watched in amazement as he guided new arrivals to this safe haven, brought food to weaker animals, and stood guard against predators. He had taken everything she had taught him about compassion and multiplied it across the entire mountain ecosystem. During one remarkable incident, cameras captured Storm orchestrating what appeared to be a rescue operation. When a landslide trapped several animals in a ravine, Storm worked methodically to clear a path, using techniques that showed clear planning and forethought. The researchers were stunned by the level of intelligence displayed as he solved complex problems requiring multiple steps. What amazed Martha most was how Storm balanced this extraordinary behavior with his wild nature. He never sought human food or tried to enter human spaces. Instead, he had created something entirely new, a bridge between the wild and human worlds that no one had thought possible. The local ranger station documented over 40 cases where Storm had helped humans in danger, always maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring their safety. As autumn painted the mountains again, Martha sat at her kitchen table, updating her journal with trembling hands. "What Storm has become," she wrote, "challenges everything we thought we knew about animal intelligence. He has not just survived in the wild, he has created something entirely new. My simple act of kindness that stormy night has multiplied into a web of compassion that spans these entire mountains." Scientists struggled to explain Storm's behavior, finding their traditional categories inadequate. He demonstrated levels of abstract thinking and problem-solving that went beyond what anyone had thought possible in non-human animals. Yet he remained perfectly adapted to his natural environment, using his unusual intelligence to enhance rather than disconnect from his wild nature. As Martha sat on her porch in the golden light of another autumn, she reflected on how a single stormy night had transformed not just her life, but an entire mountain ecosystem. Her old journal lay open in her lap, its pages filled with the incredible journey that began with one simple act of compassion. The mountain before her was no longer the same wilderness she had known for decades. Storm had created something unprecedented, a place where the natural order had evolved into something more complex and beautiful. Scientists who came to study the phenomenon spoke of it in amazed whispers, calling it the storm effect. How one bear's learned compassion had rippled through an entire ecosystem. Martha watched as a young deer limped past her cabin, following a path that Storm had clearly marked with broken branches. These trails, which researchers now called sanctuary routes, crisscrossed the mountain, leading injured animals to safe spaces where they could heal. The scientists had documented hundreds of such paths, each one evidence of Storm's extraordinary intelligence and care. Local schools began bringing children to learn about what was happening in these mountains. Martha would sit with them, sharing the story of that stormy night and the remarkable chain of events it had set in motion. She watched their young faces light up with wonder as they learned how one act of kindness had grown into something so much bigger than herself. The changes reached far beyond just the animals. The mountain community itself had been transformed. Hunters voluntarily created safe zones, respecting the sanctuary areas Storm had established. Neighboring landowners worked together to protect wildlife corridors. Even tourism changed, with visitors coming to witness this remarkable ecosystem where cooperation had replaced competition. Martha's simple rescue had sparked what researchers called a compassion cascade. Storm's behavior had influenced other bears, who in turn affected other species. The mountain now hosted a complex network of interspecies cooperation that challenged everything biologists thought they knew about wildlife behavior. Predator and prey species existed in a new kind of balance, one maintained not by fear, but by something remarkably close to mutual understanding. Most evenings, Storm would appear at the edge of the forest near Martha's cabin. He never came too close, maintaining his wild nature, but his presence was a comfort. She would watch as he checked on the injured animals he had brought to her, his massive form moving with surprising gentleness. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the distance, and Martha would feel the same connection she had felt when he was a tiny, shivering cub in her arms. The scientific papers written about Storm spoke of unprecedented cognitive development and behavioral adaptation, but Martha knew they missed the simpler truth. Love, once given freely, had a power all its own. Her rescue of Storm had shown him a different way of being, and in his own extraordinary way, he had chosen to pass that lesson on. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Martha made her final journal entry. We think we know the impact our actions will have, but we never truly do. One stormy night, I chose kindness over caution, love over fear. That choice rippled outward in ways I could never have imagined, touching not just one life, but countless others. Storm has shown us that the capacity for compassion knows no bounds, that intelligence and empathy can bridge the gaps between species. In saving him, I helped create something magical, something that will live on long after both of us are gone. Martha closed her journal and smiled, watching as Storm's silhouette disappeared into the gathering dusk. The mountain air was thick with the promise of another storm, but now such nights brought only joy to her heart, reminding her of how the most extraordinary journeys can begin with a single act of kindness. Did this incredible tale of Martha and Storm touch your heart? Their remarkable journey shows us how a single act of kindness can transform not just one life, but an entire ecosystem. Stories like these remind us of the extraordinary bonds possible between humans and animals. Want more heartwarming stories of unexpected animal friendships and extraordinary discoveries? Subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos like this.